if a certain side hires us, we don't go in and try to make it look like our side is correct. We just kind of provide clarification to our client on what happened.
I mean, maybe not in the next 5 years, but next 50 years, imagine all cars are going to be, I mean, right now we got a Tesla that has, 5-6 cameras on it. So if anything happens to that vehicle, you know exactly what's happening.
Most vehicles also typically record 5 seconds of pre-crash data. So usually that's speed, whether you're braking, your steering angle, whether your throttle position.
Well, when you say lost to time, you mentioned earlier they can come and call you in over a year later. What type of evidence is there at that time?
Warning, may contain car crash reconstruction, Delta V, Cockatoo facts, and/or peanuts.
I am Woodstock.
Welcome to the show. Normally I'll say your name at this point,
thanks
but
for being me. We're
going to do this one a little incognito, and we'll cover why. But you're the first collision reconstructionist I've ever met in my life. We have met each other through our daughters, actually, and years have gone by, and I didn't know what the hell you were studying and working in, and I think it's freaking fascinating. Oh, no, there's a little fruit fly. I'm not going to be able to concentrate. Earlier when we were talking, I grabbed it, caught it, thought I squished it, opened it up, and it flipped me off as it flew away. All right, well, if you see it, we'll just make it part of the show.
It's kind of a field that not a lot of people know about, and the reason why is because it's typically either involved in law enforcement, where a police department will have a collision reconstructionist division in which, they respond to major accidents on their roadways. And then also the private side is people that offer expert witness testimony to lawyers or insurance companies, or whether it's on the plaintiff or defense side, they do it for both sides. And if there's questions about how something happened, typically on the roadway, we kind of try to answer those questions from a objective scientific standpoint. So, we don't go in, if a certain side hires us, we don't go in and try to make it look like our side is correct. We just kind of provide clarification to our client on what happened. So we can do our analysis and come back to him and say, hey, it really looks like you have a strong case. Or we can come back to him and say, this doesn't look good. Your guy
Walmart, you
definitely
better
messed up.
So yeah, you're pretty much like a CSI for car accidents. Is that a good way to put it?
Yeah, and we do more than that. We slips, trips, and falls, product liability. But typically, your average firm is going to have 80% collision reconstructionists, because that's the most common type of lawsuit. And then, like I said, there's a law enforcement side of it. So you can kind of have two pathways into getting into it. And it's you can have a career in law enforcement. You get into the collision reconstructionist division in your department. They send you off for training, and then you could also do your typical 4-year college, get your engineering degree, and then go into it afterwards.
And so, can you use some of this information you get on the criminal side too to determine whether it's manslaughter versus, I don't know, and we need to get your brother back on to talk about what the actual legal terminology is, or is it all civil?
The private side can definitely be brought into criminal things as an expert. Law enforcement does it all the time, but sometimes if they're stumped, they can turn to us and say, hey, can you help us out? I have heard of a private collision reconstructionist going out to do a vehicle inspection, and they figured out that the vehicle had been tampered with, and it turned into a murder investigation.
Oh,
yeah. It was a guy that tampered with his wife's passenger side airbag and then caused a collision, and the wife died, and the collision reconstructionist figured it out.
So this guy was driving the vehicle, disabled the airbag, got his own car with him in it into an accident bad enough to kill his wife.
Yes.
That's some stuff right there.
Yeah, I remember the vehicle was a Ford Explorer. They wrote a book about it. Maybe if we take a break, I can look up the book
Maybe
title.
Rachel can find it.
I can't remember the book title. That's what I'm saying. Like, I have to like search and do all that. I don't remember the book title, but maybe I can get it for you at some point. We'll come back to it. But I mean, there's always definitely that possibility where you find out something unexpected, and you have to keep that in mind. So whenever you get a case in, you want to do like vehicle inspections where you go out and look at the actual vehicles involved. And since we're a nationwide firm, we go all over the nation and look at the actual vehicles involved. So we'll have to travel to Philadelphia or Florida or, California, because there's lawsuits all over the place that we get hired into. And so there's that aspect of the job where you're doing a lot of travel. And then you're going to the actual scene the collision occurred at and trying to look for evidence as well. The sooner you get there, the better when it comes to scene inspections, because evidence has a shelf life, especially when it comes to tire marks and like glass on the roadway or debris from the collision.
So when you get a call, it can be a, hey, you need to fly out today situation?
Yeah, it can be. It's called rapid response. And there are certain clients that have that relationship with whoever they hire. So, and we're not the only firm that does that. They'll call and we have to go right away and get there as fast as possible. And sometimes we show up and the vehicles are still on the scene. Like I've showed up to a scene before where the police are still there, gathering their evidence. And so I get in there with them and try to do my own thing. Excuse me. Yeah, and it gets really interesting because you kind of see that side of it, and you see the police have their collision reconstructionists there, and then you're there, and you're kind of doing the same thing they are.
Have you ever butted heads with one, like, no, it's this way, no, it's that way? Or do you guys even share your data with each other?
No, typically law enforcement keeps their data to themselves, and that can become a problem for us. Or I say problem, it can become an obstacle for us, because sometimes they'll like lock down the vehicles and we can't inspect them because like Texas DPS will have them on lockdown for a certain period of time while they conduct their investigation. Then we come in behind them and look at things and hope that they didn't ruin the evidence.
So they're not required to work with you to give you access right away?
Typically no, because we're a private side. So that's kind of outside of our jurisdiction to be able to like compel law enforcement to produce evidence unless there's a lawsuit already filed and then, there's been a court order, subpoenas, things like that. You can get into them having to produce evidence like that, but that takes time. Typically, the court moves pretty slow, and that can get into months later. And sometimes, we don't get brought into a case and like years later. I think the statute of limitations in Texas for filing a personal injury lawsuit is 2 years. So, I mean, it is kind of a tactic to wait and then file, because I'm not saying everyone does this, but it is a tactic to wait and hopes that certain pieces of evidence are no longer around.
Disappeared. So, I mean, this isn't just some like soccer mom that got in a bender. They're not the type of people hiring you. Like, is this mostly commercial vehicles, or is it between just two random personal vehicles?
It can actually be both. Commercial vehicles tend to be the larger cases because they carry the larger insurance policies.
Yeah.
So, whenever there's a collision and a commercial vehicle hits somebody else, they're going to want to go after the entire insurance policy, So, and we can get hired by either side, the person that got hit or the person that did the hitting.
So is it usually like a law office that's hiring you, a corporation, the insurance company itself?
Typically, if it's plaintiff side, it's the law office. If it's defense side, it can be the law office or the insurance company directly. Sometimes it's the companies directly. They self-insure, and they know, the in-house lawyer knows about it and knows to bring in a collision reconstructionist or like a biomechanic or to start doing an analysis.
Like a big shipping company, they get an accident, they're like, hey, we need to make sure our asses are covered. They'll reach out to your company and say, hey, come check this out to ensure that our guy is actually liable, or I guess give us all the
not,
info.
Yeah, and sometimes there's not even a lawsuit involved yet, but they think there's going to be, so they want to preserve evidence. So they'll bring us in pre-suit and just like do, vehicle inspections, scene inspections, get those out of the way. That way, none of the evidence gets lost to time. And
when you say lost to time, you mentioned earlier they can come like and call you in like over a year later. What type of evidence is there at that time?
Well, can be a couple different things. Typically, there's no scene evidence. Typically, I say sometimes there is, because let's say someone hit a metal telephone pole. You can go out there and find scrapes on there because those don't usually change. Or sometimes they mess up the curb. They put grooves into the curb on the cement, and you can kind of find those things. But one thing that will always be there, if it existed, is the black box data in the car. So I say black box data, it's kind of the common term, but usually it's the data that is relevant to the collision is stored on the ACM of the vehicle. And the ACM stands for Airbag Control Module. So all vehicles manufactured past September 1st, 2012 are federally mandated to have a capability of recording a collision that reaches a certain threshold. Typically, that's 5 miles an hour delta V being the change in velocity over time. So most manufacturers are compliant. GM and Ford were pretty much doing it on all their vehicles before that. There was a couple other manufacturers that were already doing it. I think Toyota was already putting downloadable ACMs in their vehicles before the federal mandate. I think most vehicles use the company Bosch to be compliant. They sell a kit that you can plug into the vehicle and access the data, and it'll give you a certain parameters of data, like longitudinal delta V, lateral delta V, accelerations that the vehicle experienced, whether it's X, Y, or Z direction, like roll rate, like if the car was experiencing degree change in its aspect, like some vehicles will record that, and then most vehicles also typically record 5 seconds of pre-crash data. So usually that's speed, whether you're braking, your steering angle, whether your throttle position, things like whether your cruise control was on. And some manufacturers record more than others. It's kind of up to them because it's really only federally mandated. You have to get like the actual collision data, like the changes in velocity and accelerations and things like that.
So if you show up later, there's not going to be any, minimal physical evidence, especially on site. You may have a vehicle that's just been sitting in a compound, but mostly it's going to be the quote-unquote black box, the airbag.
Yeah, it's very valuable data, and it's valuable if you get a download and it has an event on it, and it's also valuable if it doesn't, because we know there's a threshold that the car has to meet to be able to record it. And so if that threshold is not met, it kind of gives us some parameters to look at with what the collision didn't meet.
And I imagine there's more than one vehicle involved sometimes, many times, and you're going to be able to compare the two data.
Right.
Okay. So what do we got here? EDRs?
Event data recorders.
Okay. Voluntarily installed by many vehicle manufacturers. 2002. However, the specifics of the data recorded, the amount and type of data vary depending on the manufacturer. I think you said 2012 there was required, but in 2016 regulations were introduced which specified the 15 minimum parameters. Okay. So lateral, longitudinal delta V, as you were saying, vehicle indicated speed, engine throttle percentage, brake status on or off. That way if grandpa's falling asleep at the wheel,
ignition cycles you see there, that's helpful in if it is like a long time ago, it can kind of give us an idea of when this event is from. So you can, because there's data out there that tells you how often the average person turns their vehicle on, and that's an ignition cycle. So
well, it says ignition cycles crash, and then the next one says ignition cycles download. What's the difference?
So if the crash occurs and the car is still driven for a year or two before we get to look at it, all those ignition cycles are being added to it, and so it keeps track. So when the crash occurs,
since the crash, and then
when the crash occurs, that's the number of ignition cycles, and when then you actually plug into it and download it, that's the number of ignition cycles.
So if you're called a year later, does law enforcement typically have this information? No, because I've been sideswiped to where it was like actually totaled, and I don't remember them getting any data from the car. So
typically law enforcement likes to download if there's a fatality, or if there's like a severe crash in which people are severely injured, or if there is a question of criminal negligence, they'll like to download the vehicles themselves. So we have gotten downloads from law enforcement before that they got, and then we got later.
So on a typical one, you're going to show up, you actually have, it's recent, right? Most of them are not a year after the fact. Or would you say, how often is it that you get called right away, so you actually have the vehicles on
not
site?
As often as I would like.
So it's not like I imagine, like you show up, they're pulling the bodies away, you've got some, magnifying glass and glasses on with a notepad, and you're measuring like skid marks. How often does that actually come into play?
I think it depends on the firm. I will say that, the bigger firms will get called like that more often than smaller firms. But I mean, it's only happened to me a couple times.
We were there like right after the crash happens,
right?
And you're just flying all over the nation to just try to get there as soon as possible.
Typically, like the rapid response that we get is in Texas, usually within driving distance. But I have flown to a rapid response before.
Are there a lot of companies like yours throughout the nation?
Yeah, there's several, and they vary in size, and sometimes it's just a guy that had a career in law enforcement that did collision reconstructionists, and then he retired, and he started his own little engineering firm and offers services. And it could just be one guy, or it could be thousands of people. That there are some firms that their specialty is expert testimony, so they have a collision reconstructionist division, they have a biomechanics division, they have a human factors and conspicuity division, they have
those are a lot of words that I almost understand.
So biomechanics is like your potential for injury whenever you have forces applied to the human body, and they kind of go hand in hand with an accident reconstructionist. So the accident reconstructionist will determine the forces that got applied to the car, and then the biomechanic will use those forces to determine.
Sorry, I almost had to sneeze.
The severity, no problem. The severity of injury that you can achieve with these forces. What's the likelihood of the injuries that the plaintiff is claiming with the forces involved, and that's also a job that can be plaintiff or defense. The plaintiff can hire a biomechanic, the defense can hire a biomechanic, and they'll have their own opinions about the collision and the forces and like the potential for injury. Human factors is like if you're driving and someone comes up to the side, like how long does it take you to react? Like perception response time. And in different scenarios, like whether it's at night or like whether it's like the sun is in your eyes or, there is distractions in the road. That all kind of plays into how a driver responds to stimuli. And so there's experts that specifically study that and then kind of look at the circumstances of the crash and determine whether or not the driver's responses were reasonable or not. Like whether or not they should have done something different or whether it was expected of them to, respond in a different way. And so then conspicuity is like how well...
Say that one.
Conspicuity?
Conspicuity?
Conspicuity, I believe.
Conspicuity.
How you say it?
I love new
I could
words.
be saying it wrong. It's like how well can you see something like a construction road sign?
Oh, okay.
The reflectivity, what the reflectivity needs to be.
The quality of being noticeable or easy to see. Okay. Most bike riders wear brightly colored shirts or jackets to enhance their conspicuity. Yeah,
Right.
It looks like you're saying it right. Well, new word of the day, kids.
So, a good way to explain it is like if someone stops on the highway and it's like 70-mile-an-hour traffic, and someone hits them behind, like should they have been able to tell that the car was stopped and brake in time?
Because the black box won't have whether their lights were on or anything like that.
Typically, It doesn't have if the lights are on. I think there is some discussion on changing or updating the legislation to require more things to be recorded because most cars are digital now, controlled by computers and not like analog lights. So, they would have the ability to say whether the lights are on or blinkers were on or whatever. But right now, the federal government doesn't require it, so most manufacturers aren't doing it.
I imagine, maybe not in the next 5 years, but next 50 years, imagine all cars are going to be, right now we got a Tesla that has, 5-6 cameras on it. So if anything happens to that vehicle, you know exactly what's happening. Makes your job.
The thing about Tesla, though, is that data is considered proprietary. So whenever we go to download a Tesla, they give us the required stuff, but they won't give us the rest of it. We have to request it from Tesla.
So is the owner's data?
Yeah, if the owner has the video, he can provide it if he would like. And typically, if there's a lawsuit involved, it's considered evidence. And through the process of discovery, the other side can compel them to produce whatever video and stuff like that they have. But
so it depends on whether we want to live in the Big Brother world, whether we have a legislature to require the release of those videos or not.
Right. And I think it kind of goes into the question of like, what's your expectation of privacy on the roadway, which is really not much. A lot of cameras are everywhere now, dash cams and traffic light cams, and it's just a matter of you being able to get that data in a timely manner to where you can do your analysis before your report's due for the court. Because I'm sure tons of traffic lights have cameras, but it is a process to try to request it. And you have to go through your client, like the lawyer, like, hey, can you check with the city, see if they have it, see if they can get it for us? And typically it's a no because whatever reason.
Because we're lazy and we don't have to.
Yeah, exactly.
So when you get all your data, how often is it not black and white? Meaning, I imagine some of them are clearly, hey, it was this guy's fault, no doubt. Other times it may be a little muddier. Is it typically very clear who is at fault?
Not very typically. And most of the cases that we get involved in aren't necessarily liability cases, but are instead personal injury cases. So, liability tends to not be in question. Sometimes it is, sometimes it's not. But we still have to quantify the forces involved to the vehicle for the biomechanic to come on top of our analysis and try to determine, the injury potential.
So it's like maybe they already had a busted up body and they got in a 1 mile per hour wreck and they're trying to sue for millions, even though they had a pre-existing, or like
That can definitely happen. And it kind of, there are some firms that tend one way or the other, where some firms are mainly defense and some firms are mainly plaintiff. There are some firms that kind of in the middle. So the lawyers kind of know who to go to, if they have a certain type of case. So if you have like a real low speed case, and you're a defense lawyer, there are firms in the country that you can go and get a real good defense. And then on the other side of it, the plaintiff can go to a firm that kind of tries to help them out a little bit. So it can go either way.
Do you ever have to be an expert witness in court?
Yes. I mean, that's kind of our ultimate product, which is our opinions.
It's not just supplying data, it's you physically have to show up to court and
you have to defend what your analysis was.
Okay.
And so you have to keep that in mind whenever you're building your analysis. So any opinion that you have needs to be backed up with some sort of study or testing, or you have to have some reason that you're saying the things that you're saying. So you can't just go out and be like, I think it's this, and you don't have anything
all
to
that
back
through discovery and everything. And
so there's a ton of like published data when it comes to collisions, like different types of collisions that you can use to kind of back up what you're saying. And it also it can also influence like what type of analysis you choose to do for the wreck that it is. So like you're gonna choose a different type of analysis when it's like a sideswipe type thing versus like a collinear, two vehicles banging into each other. There's different papers and studies that cover those distinct aspects. There's kind of different pathways you get into it. You get the law enforcement pathway. There's typically two schools that people go to kind of continue their education in this field. The gold standard in the industry is Northwestern Center for Public Safety, and they have a series of courses that you can do for your collision reconstruction, and it will kind of take you from the beginning where you go out to the scene and do an investigation and gather evidence, and like teaches you evidence gathering techniques, and like from things like measuring tire marks to how to photograph in sunlight. They go through all of it.
How to photograph in sunlight?
Yeah, your settings on your camera matter whenever it comes to how well the evidence will show up in a photograph.
Okay.
So things like your focal length and your exposure and your other settings. And then they kind of take you through how to gather data from vehicles and how to kind of use that to build an analysis. And typically what they teach you how to do is what the accreditation for collision reconstruction certification group wants you to know to be able to pass the certification exam to be considered a certified collision reconstructionist. That group is called ACTAR, and they're kind of a worldwide thing. They host exams all over the world for collision reconstructionists to take and try to be considered a certified collision reconstructionist. There's another school called IPTM. They're out of University of North Florida, and they have a similar curriculum to Northwestern, but they kind of cater to the law enforcement side of things. You can see Institute for Police Technology and Management, so it's in the name, police.
So they have these places to go and learn this. How the heck do you actually get into this? Like, what actually drew your attention to it and got you to the point where you wanted to go through with it?
I kind of fell backwards into it because I didn't go to school for this, and I got out of college and I was just kind of looking for a job, and this came along, and I looked into it, and I was like, man, this is pretty cool. And every day is different, and you have to really use your brain, and you're constantly having to learn because the field is always changing. The field is always changing. And also, if you're really kind of dedicated to being at the top of your field, you also want to do research and testing and publish studies on yourself, because it will go on your CV, which is your curriculum vitae. I think that's how you say
your resume.
Well, it's a little different than a resume, because a resume is like what you give whenever you're trying to get a job. Your curriculum vitae is what all your accomplishments that you've done throughout your life whenever you're kind of trying to present to people who you are, what your qualifications are.
Okay.
And you have to present it to the court as well.
An itemized list of a person's entire education, publications, accomplishments, notable projects, awards, honors, achievements, and professional experiences. So yeah, I heard CV, that's what they call it over like pretty much the rest of the world.
Click on what is a CV versus a resume. I want to see what it says.
Yeah, so everywhere else in the world I've been, they just use CV interchangeably with resume.
I always thought the CV more of like a your elevator pitch written down versus a resume is a little more like career-based driven.
I don't know. In our field, a CV is what we give the court to kind of let them determine whether or not we're qualified to speak about what we're trying to speak about. Because the court can limit your testimony or strike you. So that's like a big thing that you want to avoid, and it's a very common tactic that the opposing side of whatever opposing side that you're on will try to do. There's something called a Daubert challenge, in which they basically go before the judge and say, they give a million reasons why this guy doesn't know what he's talking about and he shouldn't be allowed to testify. And it can get pretty personal.
Have you been attacked that way?
No,
Okay.
I've never had that. I haven't done. I'm not far enough into my career to be giving expert testimony yet.
Okay.
So that comes later.
So as you're studying all of this, what type of background would be best to have to be successful at your job?
Honestly, the types of background are pretty varied, because there are a lot of different guys have great careers, and they come from law enforcement, or they're an engineer, and they've done a lot of research, or they've been in the field for a long time, and you can kind of make a name for yourself over time in like a specific aspect. So like there's like a motorcycle guy, his name is Nathan Rose. He wrote the textbook on motorcycle accident reconstruction, and he's kind of known for being the guy when it comes to motorcycle crashes. Then put him up here. I've met this guy. He's a pretty cool guy. He also teaches some courses for SAE, which is the Society for Automotive Engineers. Speaking of SAE, I talked about ACTAR earlier, how their collision reconstruction certification. SAE is also doing something similar, but there's no exam for SAE. You take a series of courses to be considered a certified accident reconstructionist.
So you just have to take the course. You don't have to prove you actually understand.
I think
anything.
it's a series of 5 courses, and there's final exams for each course.
When we were talking earlier the other day, you were talking about how you had to take a pretty intensive exam. It was all written, like paper, pencil. It took a while to grade it because of that. It wasn't just like multiple choice. But you said you don't even use that anymore in the whole entire industry.
Well, I wouldn't say you don't use it. You use kind of like the ideas that are within that specific type of analysis. The math is sound. But what that is the ACTAR exam that you have to go through to get your ACTAR certification. And there's two parts to it. And the first part is like the practical, the theory. And that's like a series of questions. Like they can be multiple choice, they can be true or false, they can be word questions. And that typically it's like 70 something questions, and they give you about 4 hours. And sometimes there's a word question, and it gives you like a scenario, and you have to start figuring out the scenario. And like there's 6 questions based on that scenario, and they all kind of build off of each other. So if you make a mistake in the first one, then your other answers will be wrong because you did something wrong in the first part.
So you really have to intimately know the whole industry in order to pass that test.
Well, technically they say that the ACTAR certification is like your minimum standard for being considered an accident or collision reconstructionist. It's not everything that you need to know. It's like, are you minimally competent to be able to do the job?
Are there like future exams that you can pass to be more advanced, or is it just experience after that?
What they want is continuing education credits for you to keep your certification. And I think you have to have 40 or 80, it might be on the website. I'm not sure exactly the number, but if you like go to courses or seminars, or you publish, that all can count towards your continuing education within the accident collision reconstructionist field. And if you notice, I'm saying accident then correcting myself because it's very common for people to refer to this field as accident reconstruction, but the proper term is collision reconstruction, because I don't know if y'all have seen Hot Fuzz, but whenever he talks about the word accident, implies that there's nobody at fault. And it's very true. You want to use the word collision because, whenever you're coming in to investigate, you try to kind of figure out who's liable and who's not, and what went wrong. Because if 2 vehicles occupy the same space at the same time, well, something went wrong.
Someone's not supposed to be there. Or both.
Here we go.
No, here's the... Are we allowed to play this? Let's play it. Did you find the actual...
Car accident. Nasty way to go.
Constable official VERCAP guidelines state we no longer refer to these incidents as accidents, they're now collisions.
What happened, Daddy?
Traffic collision.
Oh.
Wait, why can't we say accident again?
Because accident implies there's nobody to blame.
Nice.
Exactly.
Rachel. Got it.
And I think it's within the name of ACTAR, they use the word collision instead of accident. So, what was I talking about before that?
A lot of stuff, man. A lot of good stuff. Well, I love learning new stuff. I love learning stuff that...
Oh, the ACTAR exam. Sorry to interrupt.
Okay. Go at it.
The second portion of the ACTAR exam is what's called the practical. And they give you a sheet of paper, and it has some lines on it. And then they kind of give you a grid that has coordinates on it. And they tell you this is the left front wheel of a Pontiac, and then this is the right front wheel of a Pontiac, and you have to map it out and use the lines that are on the paper to determine what the pathway of each vehicle was during the collision, and then work your way backwards to where they were when they met, what their positions were whenever they collided with each other, and then work backwards from there. What were their starting positions? And you use that information to determine their impact speeds, their point of final rest, and you also are able to determine like their change in velocity. And that's all basically built from the ground up from just a few lines on a piece of paper. And that's usually the hardest part of the test, and the part that the people fail the most. And I think I've heard that 50% of people fail the ACTAR exam the first time.
Wow.
Yeah. And it's it can be people that have been working in collision reconstruction for a long time and they still fail the ACTAR because you're measuring by hand and you're having to use a protractor, and the angles that you determine the cars separated at go into determining the speeds within your momentum equation. And so if a couple degrees off on those angles that you measure, it can kind of create a cascading effect on your whole set of equations that you're going to use to determine what speeds there were. If you YouTube ACTAR exam box method, I believe it might give you a
visual of
visual of what I'm talking about. So yeah, this is what you start off with.
Oh yeah, that's clear as day.
And so these are the tire marks. Typically, ACTAR exam practicals are built off of known crash tests, and so they took two vehicles and smashed them into each other. They had instruments on them, and they were recording the whole thing. So they know all aspects of the crash, but they only give you the tire marks and like some coordinates that you can place on the paper to determine where things ended up.
Yeah, so most people are going to be listening to this. So what we're looking at right now is just chicken scratch. It looks like just a few, someone took a pencil and just made some arcs across a white screen. That's it. And you're supposed to take that as tire marks and recreate an entire collision.
Right.
All right.
So you can see here that
slightly harder than getting your real estate degree.
You can see here that the lines that have like little dashes in them, those are like the approach vectors for the vehicles coming into the crash. And then whenever they change direction, that's going to be your departure angles. So if you have your departure angles, you can then try to use a momentum equation to determine speeds, your impact speeds and stuff like that.
So how much margin of error can you have before you fail this thing?
I'm not sure
exactly right on,
but
are you?
From what I've heard, they use something called a Monte Carlo analysis to have like some statistical way of determining how wrong you are. So if you're like within like a certain margin of error to like the actual real life car crash, you can still pass. But if you like get out too far, then you'll fail. So I was going to bring up something else with this. Can you go back to the previous view that we had up where the vehicle was facing the other way? Because it reminded me of something I wanted to say.
You say vehicle facing the other way, but I'm still just seeing chicken scratch.
Okay, the vehicle is over there. You can see it's got four tires and a direction
vector. The Durango
vector
coming in from the right, the darts coming forward.
Right, yeah, the green and red. So whenever most crashes average 150 milliseconds. So whenever the cars come together and then they separate, that time when they're together is about 150 milliseconds. So then after that, the ground forces start to take over, which is like the frictional forces between the tire and the roadway, and they start to change the car's direction and whenever they get to final rest. And so that little window in which they change direction from the impact, that's the window you have to capture your departure angles at. Because if you just take a ruler and draw a line from, where they hit to where they ended up, your angle is going to be wrong. So you want to get the departure angle that they had right after they separated, after the collision, because that's the momentum departure angle that is not being influenced by the ground forces of your tires. I know this is like probably going way over your head.
We've lost me and a few other people, but it does make it way more understandable if you're looking at it. So if you're watching the video on whether it's Spotify or YouTube, it's going to make a lot more sense versus just listening.
So what I said all that to say this, there's a small little spot. If you zoom in, can you zoom in on this? Yeah. There's a small little spot in which you take your angle measurement. And so if you go past that, your angle starts to come off, and it starts to have a cascading effect on all your system of equations that you're using to model the crash. So you have to keep that in mind whenever you're in the exam doing your practical. All right, I can't go too far to measure my angle, and I can't go too close to the cars because they haven't quite gotten there yet. So there's like a little space in there that you get your measurement.
I'm going to trust that they teach you how to actually know what the hell all of that is. Well, that's fascinating, man. I'm glad that we have people out there like that, so I don't have to do it. I enjoyed physics. I enjoyed math class and stuff like that. But man, I just like learning new stuff, then moving on. That's probably a little too in-depth for me.
So what's interesting about the ACTAR is that it's kind of based on having all the information that's available at the scene. So like you have like all the tire marks, the grooves coming in, like whenever whenever the cars impact, they get pushed down into the roadway. So metal parts will scrape the roadway and create grooves. You have all that information to be able to do an analysis like that. But during your typical cases that you get hired for all the time, you don't get that. You get a few photos of the cars, maybe you get a download, and you have to kind of build an analysis off of that. So there have been published things that use different methods to kind of answer questions that you can't answer unless you have the roadway evidence. So, for example, if you're just kind of trying to determine the forces applied to one vehicle, you can take crush measurements of that vehicle. And there's a paper written by Campbell, I think in 1976, that does this, where you take, you have like a area of crush, like say the front of your car is crushed. And it's like, say your front of your car is like 63 inches and it's crushed in so much. So you have to determine like 6 equal areas of crush, and you plug that into an equation. And then you also use the specific stiffness values for the components that make up the car. And that will give you the amount of force that it took to crush the vehicle that much.
Do they have databases of all the different vehicles and their materials and weights?
So that's a good question. If you look up the NHTSA vehicle crash database, NHTSA is the one that kind of does the new vehicle crashes testing to determine like how roadworthy they are and like give them the safety rating and all that. Within those crash tests, there, like if you click on vehicle crash, you can glean data from specific crash tests that are specific to a model of a car. So let's look up a vehicle. Let's look up Chevrolet Suburban.
Oh, of course, Rachel immediately goes to Tesla.
Tesla.
Sorry, we both know.
Sycophants. So what are we going to look up?
Let's look up a Chevrolet Suburban because that's a very common vehicle, and there's multiple crash tests out there for that.
Okay.
You can just click search, and it should bring some stuff up. So there's all these crash tests, and if you look at the where it says like sled testing, in-cap side pole, things like that, those are all the different types. But what we want is the frontal barrier impact test. So right there, 4, 5, 6, 7.
What'd you do? Scroll back down, I think. There you go.
So just if you look on the
4, 5, 6, 7, there, like 4 from the bottom
column, you'll just look for any frontal barrier impact test. Yeah, there's one at the very bottom.
It's 4 from the bottom. That new car assessment program frontal barrier impact test. So where do we click on there?
Yeah.
There we go.
So these frontal impact tests are done with crashing the vehicle into a barrier that has load cells on them.
Load cells?
So like
They test
They're-
forces?
they're little squares, and they test. There's a whole grid of them, and they measure how much force is imparted onto that specific area of the barrier. And so if you use that, you can determine stiffness values from these tests that will go into that Campbell equation, and then you have a model that's specific to that vehicle, that gives you the force that it took to crush the vehicle as much as it did. So it's kind of like gleaning data from different areas to kind of build your analysis. And then whenever you write your report, you can point to this and be like, this is what I used, and this is why I used it, to determine that the forces involved was this, and the delta V was this, and the accelerations were this.
Thus proves that Grandma did not hit her brakes. I guess that would be part of the black box data, huh?
Yeah.
Whether the brakes were applied or not.
This is typically, something like that is typically used for like a personal injury case, in which, all right, we need to know the amount of force that was imparted to the vehicle the occupant was in, and then the biomechanic can figure out whether or not it's likely that they're injured.
So if they're saying my client's a moron, you can prove that they were a moron before the crash.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's just one example of a analysis that you can do whenever you have more limited evidence than what a full, accident or collision reconstruction that ACTAR wants you to do. And there's different ones out there that kind of apply to different situations. Like a side swipe is a totally different situation than a frontal collision, and the way the forces are applied to the vehicle are different. But there's studies out there that, they took a bunch of cars out, did sideswipe maneuvers on them, and then published the data. And then from there, an algorithm was built on top of that, and gives you a way to kind of, figure out the severity of a sideswipe. Or like a oblique, crash, that's a totally different type of analysis that you have to do. So, whenever I say that ACTAR wants you to be minimally competent, that's what that means. You need to, if you're going to be a true collision reconstructionist, you need to understand multiple different types of ways of approaching.
Is what I'm hearing. You understand a lot of info.
Multiple different ways to approach a singular collision, and be able to look at it and determine, like, how am I going to approach this, and what type of analysis am I going to use? How can I get to where I need to get with just what I have?
Look, I think that's fascinating, and my brain is completely jam-packed full of as much as I can understand with collisions. That it's way more complicated than I ever imagined. I thought it was complicated too, but I think that's well above what a standard average Joe listening to the show is going to be able to absorb. That being said, I want to talk a little bit more about you, man. I heard your bird died.
Oh, man, that's just happened today. I'm not happy about that.
So I actually learned something about parrots today. So it was a cockatoo.
Yeah. So cockatoos are the largest of the parrot family, I believe. And because macaws are, I think, a little bit different than an actual parrot, so they're not considered a parrot. Cockatoos are the biggest parrot. And they're really cool birds. There's different types. We had an umbrella cockatoo, and it was like it was bonded with my daughter most of all, and loved to be cuddled, and wanted your attention all the time. So those are different types of cockatoos. And he could say words.
Different.
He'd say hello. He'd say, "I'm a pretty bird." He would say his name, different things like that. And you could sit there and kind of talk to him. And sometimes he'd get upset if you walked by his cage and didn't talk to him. He'd yell until you went over there and said, "Okay, I'm sorry, Sam. I'm sorry I didn't talk to you." And then he would also get upset if you left the light on when he's trying to go to bed, and he'd yell and yell and yell and yell and yell until you turned it off.
So how do you come across a cockatoo?
Well, we got ours kind of luckily because it was previously owned by an older lady that was getting sick and couldn't take care of it anymore. So she asked my mother-in-law to find somebody to take care of her bird. So we took it on, and it was awesome having it. It was an experience for sure.
How long did you have, boy or girl?
Pretty sure as a boy. It's really hard to tell without actually going to like a vet and saying, "Hey, what is my bird?" You know, what's similar to that is snakes. Snakes, like pythons, are really hard to tell the sex of. You have to like probe them. Or you can get like a DNA test, I think, if you want. Some people do that.
So you had an umbrella cockatoo. The picture up here that looks pretty awesome. Just big old plumes on the top of the head, a little fluff out.
Yeah. So like it's a signal that he either wants to play or he's getting kind of aggressive. They always use the feathers on top of the head to kind of tell you, hey, pay attention to me. And I think they also use that for like mating rituals and stuff like that.
Let me see. What's that saying? In cockatoos, eye color can be, but is not always an indicator of sex. Females that have become sexually mature develop a red coloration to their irises. Did your bird have red eyes?
No.
All right. Yeah,
pretty sure it was a boy. We were told it was a boy, but I never actually got it checked.
Did you have deep brown color? Was that the eye color?
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
You had a dude. Yeah, the dude. So I guess birds are not.
How long does it take to get sexually mature for a cockatoo, though? You know, because we weren't too sure of the age either.
Because you were saying they can live like, what, 50 years or so?
Yeah.
And so
50 to 70 years.
I mean, I imagine it'd be similar to adults, like a few years to be sexually. For smaller species, 2 years. For medium species, 3 to 4. So I imagine 2 years or less.
Larger species, which is.
Oh, is this specifically for birds? I'm thinking, well, humans, I'm still not.
5 to 8 years.
5 to 8 years.
They were then considered adults.
So you don't know if it was that old or not because you adopted it?
Yeah. We had it for about 2 years.
Well, now we'll never know. What was his name?
Sam.
Well, Sam, shout out up above if you're listening from above to all your cockatoo friends.
So the reason I didn't want to bring my name into this is because there are lawsuits involved with all our cases, and most lawyers are cool, but there are those lawyers that you hear about. You know, the lawyer jokes come from, in which they're complete. You know,
what do you call 1,000 lawyers at the bottom of the sea?
What do you call them?
A good start. Yeah.
There we go. And so those type of lawyers want to do anything to win, and they will do things like run background checks on you if you're the opposing expert witness, and they'll look up they'll look up your social media, they'll look up anything they can find on Google. They'll look up your criminal history. If you got like a parking ticket back in like 1963, well, obviously your opinion is worthless. And they'll argue that to the court. And so I just didn't want to put my name on the podcast because if I've said something stupid, they can Google it and find it and be like, hey, this guy said this back in the day.
Your Honor,
obviously,
he was
you
on
should strike him.
Idiot's podcast, and you should not listen to him. It says he's more in right there on his website.
So that's pretty much why I didn't bring my name into this.
Well, I appreciate you putting yourself out there. I know that is one of the things that I love about my show is I actively try to find people that don't want to be on the show. I get a 50-50 split. Some people are like, hey, can I be on it? Other people, I try to get as balanced as possible, and that means I'm never going to force anyone onto the show, but the amount of people that have told me after the show, wow, that was way better than I thought it was going to be. I was so nervous. I only did it because, I trusted you. That's something that I really enjoy because you typically don't get that in any other flavor of media. It does take a little bit of putting yourself out there, and especially if you're in an industry that you could potentially have it come back to you. I don't think I really delve into too much craziness on this show to where it would be, anything against you. If anything, I'd take the brunt of the idiocracy here. But thanks, man. I do appreciate it.
You all, like, another aspect of the job people don't think about until they're later in their careers, when they start actually doing their testimonies and stuff, is that you have to think about being a good expert witness on the stand, because some people are just not built for it. And they're a great collision reconstructionist, but they're not really great on the stand, and the jury doesn't find them believable. And even though they could have a perfect analysis of what happened during the collision, the jury doesn't buy it, and it doesn't mean anything. So, we encourage our experts to kind of study up on what it means to be a good expert witness, what to look for when the opposing lawyer is questioning you, because, what they'll try to do is they'll try to set you up with a series of questions that get you agreeing to something that you don't necessarily agree to, but they'll like start setting up, well, do you agree that this color is green? And then it's actually a setup, 4 or 5 questions down the way, you start agreeing with stuff that goes against what you were saying in your analysis or your report. And then there's also a good paper out there. It's like preventing the capture of your, what is that? Your amygdala, the part of your brain that kind of determines emotions.
The medulla oblongata?
Maybe something like that.
Amygdala, maybe?
Amygdala, I think, is the right one.
Okay, I was making a Waterboy joke at first.
Because a good lawyer will rile you up and kind of mess up your cool and how you're answering questions, and makes you look less credible to the jury. So you have to keep that in mind whenever you're up there. So, and then there's ways to answer questions. For this is a good example. Whenever the lawyer words a question in which it sounds like he wants a long answer, but it's actually a yes or no question, you always want to answer a yes or no, because then they have to ask the follow-up question. Let me try to give an example. Do you agree that, the Delta V was 10 miles an hour? And you can say, well, yes, then this is why I agree, and start going into your whole analysis, or you can just say yes. And then they have to figure out the follow-up question. And
so
it kind of
puts like a bedside manner for a doctor would be a courtroom manner. Yeah. Y'all.
So it puts the onus on them to get the information out of you, because your opinions are in your report that you've submitted to the court. And so what they're trying to do is they're trying to tear you down and break, because it's opposing their side. And, that goes for plaintiff and defense. They typically take depositions before you get to the actual trial. And most of the time, all the expert witnesses are deposed before trial, because it goes into helping determine whether the case will go all the way to trial or they settle, because it gives the lawyers an idea of how competent the witness is and whether or not it's going to turn out the way he wants it to.
Yeah, imagine, or I thought, and maybe I was incorrect, that it was so black and white with what you did that it would cause a lot of people to settle versus go to court.
Well, if you have a good expert witness on your side, he can kind of argue against the other one. And so they'll start to try to poke holes in your analysis. And why didn't you do it this way? Why didn't you do it this way? Why didn't you consider this? And there's always going to be something that, some piece of evidence that you want and you didn't have. And so you kind of have to have a reason why you made a choice in your analysis. And that's when you lean upon published data, testing, things like that, to support what you're saying. So if they ask you, why did you choose a certain stiffness value for the front of, for example, the Chevrolet Suburban that we were looking at, has a certain stiffness value for the bumper. But if the bumper is not what impacted the other vehicle, then the structures above the bumper are softer, so the stiffness values change depending on what material actually interacts. So you have to kind of make an adjustment, and you use your engineering discipline to kind of make that decision. And so, but that's kind of gives them a pressure point to kind of push on, like, why did you make that decision? Or well, I based it on the load cell barrier data in the NHTSA test.
Well, I imagine lawyers aren't going to have an in-depth knowledge enough about this. Maybe if they're a specialized lawyer, but are they bringing their own company and getting their own data and putting that against yours?
Yes.
Like, is it common to where
each side is going to have their own accident reconstructionist?
Okay.
And
y'all nod at each other and be like, "Hey, what's up?"
Well, yeah, it's a small field, and we all know each other.
And you say it's like unbiased. You have to say that, but is it common to have one side lean towards whoever hired them?
I will say a common question during deposition is, what is your percentage for plaintiff cases? What is your percentage for defense cases? Because it's all on your CV. Every time you've testified, it goes on your CV. And so they try to kind of look at that and see if you have, 90% plaintiff and only 10% defense cases, or 90% defense, only 10% plaintiff cases, then they try to say, well, you really only work for the defense, so you must, be biased against, plaintiffs. And like, no, we just go with what the science says. And if the science is not on your side, then I don't know what to tell you. But I mean, if you want to hire us. You may not like what we say, but you can still hire us, and we'll do an analysis for you. Because, I mean, there's been plenty of times where, we get a client and they want us to do analysis, and, we come back and it's not the result they wanted. And it costs them money because, they have to settle out for a higher amount than what they wanted to.
Well, doing God's work, getting that info out there. But yeah, I appreciate you coming on. Like I said, it's never easy to put yourself out there. But I definitely learned a lot. There's probably have more questions that I had beforehand, but we definitely got way more information than I ever expected there was about collision reconstructionism. I still can't get that down. Collision reconstructionism? Is that?
Collision reconstructionist? That's what I am.
That's a cool term.
Collision reconstruction is what we do. And another thing is, like, if you have a big enough case, sometimes we can do like full-scale crash tests in which we get the actual vehicles, like exemplar vehicles. So like,
oh no way! So you get the actual vehicles that were in it,
yes.
and you try to reconstruct the entire.
Yeah. So, but those are very expensive. They can easily get to like $35,000-$40,000 for just the test. And I've seen it to where the company, if it's a commercial motor vehicle, the company provided an 18-wheeler for us to crash into a Cadillac Escalade, I think it was. Because
they could be potentially saving millions of dollars.
Yeah, so if they have, $5 million insurance policy, and the people is asking for the whole $5 million, you spend, $50,000 to save yourself $5 million. And so, that's always interesting whenever you do a full-scale crash test. That's like my favorite thing to see.
Oh, so you've been able to experience all that?
Yeah, and we put people, if we have a pretty good idea of what the forces are going to be, we'll put people in the vehicles during the crash test and put sensors on them. So, like, we'll tape a sensor to their neck, and like we'll have like something around their waist, and then we'll put a bite block in their mouth.
Where do you find these people? Just you get employees that volunteer?
What you want to do is get what's called a surrogate. And so that is someone that pretty well matches the height and weight and gender of.
But isn't this like an injury thing? You're like, is there potential for these people to get injured in this?
Well, if we're getting to a crash test, we've already done some sort of analysis to kind of determine kind of where the forces are, so we don't want to put anybody in the vehicle that's going to get injured. If it's a severe one, then we can use crash test dummies that have instruments in them.
Okay.
But ideally you would use a surrogate that's the same height, weight, and gender as the person that was in the collision, and you put them in the vehicle. And so you try to match damage. So if it matches the damage that the subject vehicle had on it, then you can point to it and be like, all right, we matched the damage, put two people in the vehicle, and, you know, they didn't get injured. And these were the forces that their actual bodies experienced sitting in the seats. Because most of your analysis that when it comes to vehicles, collision reconstruction, it's, you know, what are the forces at the CG of the vehicle? And so typically
CG?
The center of gravity.
Okay.
Typically that is usually in between the two front seats. That's usually where your center of gravity is. And so you kind of have to think about if the force at the center of gravity is this, you know, what is it at the occupant space? And it can be different depending on the parameters of the collision. So a crash test can, you know, you get the data directly because you have people sitting in the seats with sensors on them.
So in that scenario, it's someone's trying to sue a company for a boatload because they're like horrifically injured, but you see the data doesn't match up. You're like, no, there's no way that they would get this injured. And we're actually putting people in these vehicles reconstructing, and there's no better proof than that, right?
Right. You know, after you do the crash test, it still has to go to a biomechanic, and, you know, he does his analysis, but then you have even more data for him to work off of. So that is the idea behind it. And you also can do like crash tests to, for example, there's multiple scientific papers out there for crashes that involve, you know, two SUVs or two cars or a car and an SUV colliding with each other. And if you want to kind of expound upon that data and, you know, reinforce it, you can do crash tests to do that and then publish on them. And then there is, I've lost my train of thought. Cool.
Well, I did have a question. How often do you deal with multiple vehicles? Like a bunch of pileups and stuff?
We do get those in. It's not very often because those pileups are pretty rare. As it begins, as far as compared to like the overall number of collisions in the country, you know, pileups like that tend to be pretty rare. But it gets in, you know, it can get pretty complex if you have like 5, 6, 7 vehicles involved. You know, I had a case where it was like a tractor trailer hit the back of a tractor trailer, who then hit the back of a work truck, who then hit a passenger car, who then hit another passenger car, who then hit another passenger car, and the plaintiff was like the one that's like up here, and we only had access to the 2 tractor trailers, and so, you know, you had to like try to build your analysis off of that, and it's, you know, it can get pretty tricky, but that's where you have to kind of use your engineering discipline and like all your you know, studies that you know about and the different analyses that are out there, and try to build off of that.
And then when you do go to court, I imagine whoever the firm is that hired you, they're going to depose you first and see if the data that you have actually helps them out or not. Is it common that they just choose not to even bring you? Right.
So there's what's called disclosure. And so that's whenever the lawyer on the case will disclose the expert witnesses that he's hired. And so, you know, I think we have to give our reports to them before that. And so it has been to where, you know, we do our analysis, give the report to the lawyer, and he just doesn't want to disclose us. And like the case stops there for us, you know, and that's typically because our analysis is not helping their side. You know, but that's part of being objective, you know, scientifically objective. You know, we're not here to help a particular side. We're here to shed light on the truth of what actually happened, you know, whether that helps or hurts our side or not.
Makes sense.
So what I'm hearing is you could tell us if Grandma did actually get run over by that reindeer.
If I have access to Santa's sleigh, I can
The black
inspect it.
box on Santa's sleigh.
Yeah.
Awesome, man. What else?
Man, I mean, I'm sure there's more to it that I'm missing right now, but we've gone over a lot.
Well, dude, I appreciate you coming on. next time we get you on, we'll talk a little bit more about you. I wanted to get into it. I love talking about religion personally, and you have mentioned to me that you're a religion of someone I've never actually talked to, so we'll have to jump on that next time. But we'll end it here for now. We'll leave the politics and religion to the next time.
Okay, yeah. Sounds good.
But I really appreciate it, man. We'll keep the conversation going after we turn off the mics. Take it easy, man. Bye, everybody.